So it is my pleasure to invite our speaker for this evening, Allison, and I can see that many of you know her well. She was a member of the last Port Melbourne Council prior to amalgamation, and she was a member of council from 1992 to 1994. Now I'm asking you, Lynn, did you scribble on one of those drawers back there? Certainly did not. You certainly did not. Not someone who does graffiti like some of our councillors. If you weren't here at our meeting last month, you would not have known that at the table at the back there where the councillors meet, there are drawers, and you can pull the drawers out, and then you find the graffiti from the various councillors and their signatures over quite a number of years. And they've actually got a glass panel open to sort of save them now. It all started when we were talking about Percival White, because somebody said, "Oh yes, he signed me," and he signed in a few different places. Anyway, Lynn then moved on after being on the council, and she was elected to the Senate for the Australian Democrats in 1996 and became leader of the party in 2004 until she left the Senate in 2008. She's currently the president of Westgate Biodiversity, Bili Nursery and Land Care, formed from the merger of Friends of Westgate Park and the St Kilda Indigenous Nursery. She is going to speak to us tonight about biodiversity at Westgate. So please join me in welcoming Lynn. All right. Where did those last stand? On the lectern? All right, then I'm going to go in front of the thing and I'll get out of the way. All right, well, thank you very much, especially to Gary for saving the day. I arrived with a corrupted USB and I managed to dash home and fix it on his instructions. So we will have visuals tonight, which is going to be good, I hope. All right, it's also lovely to come back into this space. I was only on council for 2 years. I got chucked out by Kennett at the time, if you remember, who did amalgamations. And so the fight was on for some months in this place, trying to save Port Melbourne Council, but alas, it's not happy. I was also kicked out of the Senate too, but that was the vote of the people of Victoria, so I can't complain about that. All right, so I've attempted to make this a kind of, pitch for locally Indigenous plants and vegetation, as well as some sort of sense of history. I've got a lot of slides, and some of them will just rush through really quickly, but there'll be others we'll talk to. Okay, so if we can have the next slide, please, Gary. Okay. Yes, it is. Maybe can I come down a little bit? Maybe this was an adjustment that was made in the transfer.
That seems to be the whole slide.
Okay, all right. Well, it's not quite, but
okay. Whoops. Yeah, it might have been the conversion.
Anyway, this is I feel somewhat inadequate in talking with an historical society about history, but this, as you will remember, you will know no doubt, was the very, very early history of what became Westgate Park. The two images there, the top one is about the river, which of course was radically altered many times over the period from settlement by Europeans right through to the image at the bottom, which is of the site, which almost covers what Westgate Park is now. I haven't got a pointer. I should just. Do we have such a thing?
We might have a pointer.
Right. So I guess the main point for tonight is not so much the early history as the site as it was in 1945. It was an airfield. It was a Commonwealth Aircraft Research Factory. It was a very deep sand mine. It was a racetrack. It was a dumping ground, generally speaking, for anything at all. So it's doubtless, even then, it would have been heavily polluted. So you can see from the image below the river and those tracks across, there we go, make this work.
Oh. Yeah, no, it was working.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So I need to hold that, yeah?
No.
Okay, so you can see the airfield runs there.
Oops, sorry. Computer.
Well, we can talk about now. There we go. And you can see the river here, and so there were the Boeing factory was in here for a research factory, the aircraft research factory. The next slide. And I included this up front. This is an image of Westgate Park taken not that long ago. I put it in first up because we think it is a remnant the only piece of remnant vegetation in the park, and it is Tecticornia arbuscula, is the name of the plant, and that's a shrubby glasswort. And that's, as you can see, the sort of slightly lowish shrubby area at the base of those trees. In front of that is Dysphyma, and the trees are Eucalyptus camaldulensis, which is, of course, the wonderful red river gum, which was throughout Melbourne, and magnificent trees. I discovered just the other day in looking at the orders that were going out from Bili Nursery that not a single eucalypt was being purchased by the council, much less the beautiful camaldulensis. So this seems to me to be a great pity. This is something we need to take seriously, because they're beautiful trees. Maybe they lose their branches, I don't know, but most trees seem to at particular times. But I think this is one thing that we can pick up on and ask the council why it is they're not planting these magnificent trees. Okay, next. Thank you. Right, more images. Oh, that's the same image, I'm sorry. And there you can see the government aircraft factory's promotion, where the bridge is already built, but of course the park has not yet been constructed. So you can see right there behind the kangaroo and the emu is the salt lake, the beginnings of the salt lake. And we think it's possible that that lake is actually connected to the sea. But it was a very deep sand mine. Even now, it's deep, as you'd expect. But when the water levels go down, a car emerges from the depths, and it's covered encrusted in salt, as you'd imagine. So there we go. So that's the beginnings of Westgate Park, and you can see that it's been used as a construction site. So that would have added to the level of contamination and materials and so forth, some of which were left behind once the bridge was erected. Okay, thanks, Gary. All right, the terrible time in our history of the bridge collapse. So a very long period of time taken to firstly plan the bridge, then start the construction, the terrible bridge collapsing with 35 men killed and many more injured. And of course the inquiry which found that the design, all these three things, design, construction and corrective action, were to blame for this terrible accident. So it was not until 1978 the bridge was reopened. That is a very recent photograph of the bridge. It's much wider now than it used to be, and I'm told it's carrying twice as much traffic as it was designed for, which is why they're forever fixing it. Okay, next. And a nice image from an aerial image which again you can see the salt lake over here. I think anyway, that this little strip of land just here is where the remnant vegetation is today. And I think you can just see a hint of some vegetation there, but it's too far away for us to know whether it's trees or what it is. But I think that's a really amazing image, and the beautiful sweep of the bridge, the lovely curving nature of it. Okay, next. All right, so this is now the construction of the park. So let's go back to my notes here. Oscar Meyer, who was chair of the Westgate Bridge Authority, wanted to create a beautiful park straddling the Yarra River to complement his sculptural bridge. The idea was to put to the federal government, and the park became the largest project to be funded for Victoria's centenary celebration in 1984-5. And in 1985, a master plan was prepared by Loader and Bili, and that emphasised the uniqueness and the grand scale of the site to be seen by motorists on the bridge every day, which indeed they do. Its fresh and saltwater lakes were the focal points, the bridge, the central sculptural feature. It would have an island visitor centre, an amphitheatre, a narrow gauge tourist railway, and it would create an inner urban park of this size with a very special relationship with the CBD and the Bay, and was one of the many far-sighted improvements to Melbourne by Planning Minister Evan Walker, executed in the Planning Department by David Yenkin. And some of you will know David Yenkin, who died just last year. So Phil was brought in and shaped into the undulating landscape with hills with which to take in the views of the lakes and lagoons. They occupied a third of the landmass, a reminder of the park's swampy past, and the salt lake, the result of a deep hole left in by 1930s sand mining. So then what happened was that they actually funded this, partially at least, funded this work, this enormous, construction of hills and wetlands. A third of the park is in wetlands, and it was funded largely by tipping fees. So people from around Melbourne, trucks and so forth, full of concrete and brio and asbestos and bricks and all sorts of things, brought this material into the park by the thousands of truckloads. And that was what was underneath. The images you can see here show a very thin layer of topsoil being put across the top of them. And you can see in the image below that there are little figures who are starting to do some planting just here. So that's the very beginnings of the park. All right. The park was opened on the 7th of November. I think we can go to the next slide. Yes, it was opened on the 7th of November. It was dedicated to the people of Victoria. It was much more modest than was first envisaged. It had just cycling paths, a composting toilet, lawns were seeded, and garden beds planted with hardy Australian species, though not all of them locally indigenous. So a lot of what is still in the park, in fact, are some species from WA, because they're really bright and kind of, much less modest than the plants that we have in Victoria. So the bridge, so what ended up happening was that, some of those plants died. A lot of them became woody and weedy, and so it started to look like you can see here. The photographs are not very good, but you get the general idea. And then what happened was the ibis turned up and came in large numbers, and they managed to sit on top of, nest on top of shrubs and so forth, which further degraded the site. So it was in a pretty bad way over much of that decade. Next slide, please. Here, a sculpture arrives. So artists come to Westgate Park. Lynn Moore produced the Earth series of 8 sandstone, granite and ironbark sculptures, and they were erected in Westgate Park in 1990. Monumental reminders of the beauty of natural materials. The stone from one of these, it's not in the picture, but from one of these sculptures actually started to slide into the ground. You know, one of the big stones from the top, you know, sort of slid off. And we had an anniversary and invited the sculptor to come to the party. And we said to her, we really want to ask you what to do about this sculpture. And she said, I would leave it there. If it slides into the earth, so much the better. So hopefully that one that's standing up there doesn't slide into anybody anytime soon, but you never know. So imposing 2 other prototype bridge sections. If you've been to Westgate Park, you'll know about them. The next slide, thanks. Oh no, not yet. Doesn't matter. So there are sections of the bridge which are in the entry, just close to the main car park, and there is one that bridges the freshwater lake with the dam. And it was, you can see it there in the background, the one at the front of the park nearest Todd Road. And we understand that in the latest work being done on the bridge, the engineers came out and actually had a look at that structure, which was apparently helpful to them in designing the extension of the main Westgate Bridge. In 1996, ahead of what I'm talking about here, a new plan emerged from Melbourne Parks and Waterways announcing the park's extension to the river and transformation of the site from a derelict wasteland. This plan would open up the riverfront parkland with trails to the river mouth and boardwalks, leisure and tourism. An observation tower at its tip would create spectacular viewing areas with wonderful vistas of the cities, Tapilda, the Bay, Williamstown and shipping activity in the port area. But like many schemes, I think there are at least 3, maybe 4, it sank without trace over time through lack of money and interest. So the poor old park was left to the mountain bike racing people and anybody really who wanted to muck around. It was hardly a park for the people. So here we have it. This is the beginning of the Friends of Westgate Park, the creation story. And in 1999, this young woman in the middle of those students had read the story of Tracks, which was a young woman who, I can't remember her name right for a moment, but a young woman who set off across Australia from, I think, Robin Davidson, thank you, Ben, set off across the country with camels. And she was so inspired by this story, she decided she would do a big walk as well, and chose to start at the headwaters of the Yarra and walk all the way through to what was Westgate Park. And when she got there, she'd never been there before, and when she got there, she was astounded that it was so derelict, that it was so lacking in care and attention. And so she gathered around her a small group of, I think this is a school group, I'm not too sure. It looks like there's a teacher standing in the background making sure everyone's behaving themselves. So she gathered people around her, friends, and as many as she could do to help start to revegetate the park. That was her plan. She was a photography student, so not all that knowledgeable or much interested really in Indigenous vegetation, but became so very much. Her initial thought was to volunteer, but there wasn't a friends group, so there was no one to volunteer with. So with the help of mentors and others, she established and incorporated the Friends of Westgate Park and set to work. One of the reasons for needing to incorporate was that she decided she needed a workforce, so she organised at 19, maybe she was 20 by this stage, she organised work for the dole programs, anything to bring labour into the park to do this work. She had some lovely things to say. She said the sheer size was daunting, but this land had been so disturbed that nothing I could do could make it worse. There were some areas of remnant salt marsh, but it wasn't the same as walking into a real remnant site. There were maybe 10 planted species, a few of them indigenous, but lots of invasives like Juncus acutus. She took baby steps, roped in friends and some others, but it was largely her own efforts. We started planting indigenous species around the park entrance, some of the salt marsh areas and the hill overlooking the lake. I knew very little about revegetation at the time, but volunteered at Skink, which is now part of the Westgate Biodiversity, and read an awful lot and identified plants by drawing. I called myself nag taught by nagging others for information. So she organised field days and planting trips with some success. And then after a year and a half, I think it was, or 2 years after she made this discovery of the park, along came George Fotheringham, a retired landscape contractor with a great passion for Indigenous plants and great knowledge, I might say too. And he loved everything in nature. Still does, he's still around. And he wanted to see this become a biodiverse place. In fact, he was I think, a guerrilla planter. We can't reveal exactly where, but a lot of the trees around Melbourne are his work, just getting in and putting them in the ground. So he was quite impressed with the fact that a young person had picked up on this little project. So that was for George about 20 years ago, and he has not stopped volunteering in the park, notwithstanding COVID, ever since. And there would be many weeks when he would be in the park every day, 7 days. A short time later, Tony Flood joined the team. He was an executive from an oil company. So many of the people who come to be volunteers tend to be kind of, making up for their past by volunteering on something useful like this. But he was a fantastic organiser, very skilled. He built a stable of organisations, corporations who would come and send teams of people to the park. He was fantastic. A hard driver, someone who wanted to see people working a lot. I think we can go to the next one. Oh yes, so these are the people that Naomi recruited, and you can see there's a bit of vegetation there, but not a lot. So go to the next one. A couple more like this. It's mostly grass, and there an area has been mapped out for a garden bed, which would have native species. So pretty much the whole of the park was weedy like this. So there were a few trees, but by and large it was couch and it's kind of grassy material. And the next one. That's, I think, at about the same time. We don't have a date for that image, but another lovely aerial shot. So that it must have been done in winter because everything's so green. It'll be in summer it turns completely different. But you can see the layout of the freshwater lake on the left-hand side. On the far left is use this device. Right here is what we call the dam, and that picks up water from Wharf Road, further down here off the image. This is the main freshwater lake. It's very shallow. That's the saltwater lake and all these little ponds that are attached to it. And this other main one is Horseshoe Lake. And there have been some other wetlands, we'll get to that a bit later, that have been introduced since that time. So, some key people involved, Rob Yule, a land care movement pioneer, established the very strong partnership between the Friends and Land Care. Neil Blake, you would all know of from Port Phillip Eco Centre, gave a lot of guidance. Lecky Ord, maybe we go to the next slide. Yes, you can see the rogues gallery of people. So that's Tony and George at the very top. Some volunteers, Martin Foley there helping out with the wheelbarrow, not for long, I might say. The image on the right in the middle of those people in yellow shirts, they were one of the corporate groups, and I tried to kind of get a photograph of the sort of before and after for that, but it was impossible because the whole area has been planted out and looks completely different. That's the trouble with befores and afters in Westgate Park. So that's the crew, our committee at the bottom left there. We employed staff in the park, so the corporates generously gave us $80 a person for accommodating corporate groups. That's how we managed to save so much money to spend on the park. So that was a very important part of what we did. And of course, they're fantastic. They're all young, and so they turn up and they fill the wheelbarrows as much as they can, and they race one another to the side, you know. So very energetic and lots of muscle. So that's all good. Next one. I should just mention Lecky Ord before going on to that slide. So Lecky Ord joined. I'm not sure how long ago, but she's been with the park at least 12 years, I would say. Jenna, do you think that was right? Yeah. And she was the former Lord Mayor of Melbourne, in fact, the first female Lord Mayor. And fortunately for us, she's a planner, so she was able to map the park, and her work together with George established this these what we call plant communities. They're not quite EBCs, but they are plant communities such as the Coast Banksia woodlands. You can see the names, probably a bit hard to read from the back there. But we planned 8 different plant communities, depending on what the soil was. There are parts of the park, the heath areas, for instance, which are very sandy. So that was the kind of, that's the plan. And we pretty much stuck with that. The area that is along here is the most recent project. I'll talk about that in a minute. This part here was added, that was Portland, that was added a few years, about 5 years ago, I think, to the park. This area here was retrieved back from the Port of Melbourne. It stole some of that. We added this triangle of land, which we call our Wharf Road Triangle. That was part of the park, and again taken by Port of Melbourne, but not used. So we managed to argue, as you can imagine, Janet, former mayor of City of Port Phillip, myself, former senator and former Port Melbourne councillor, and Lecky Ord, former, you know, we're sort of forced to reckon with, basically. So we didn't kind of take no for an answer when it came to things like, well, that's a useless piece of land for the Port of Melbourne, give it to us. So in fact, we increased the size of Westgate Park to by over 8 hectares. So the park is now 40 hectares altogether, bits and pieces in various places, as you can see. And one day we would like the park to come back down here to the mouth of the river. Unfortunately, we've got the tugboats are moored there, but you know, so what, you know, and why not have it, have a pathway going through there anyway. So that's a long-term campaign of ours. We probably can't acquire more land, but that's definitely in the offing, I reckon.
Is there any railway line still coming through there? Or still?
Yes. This is the sad story. There is that line there is the old railway line.
I couldn't read it.
Yep. And a plan for that is for the railway line to be reinstated. And you know, most of us think that's a really good idea, except that it'll come on the route that's there, and then it will go through here and right down in this area here, pretty much destroying that part of the land. And it may well cut off this part of the park from the river, what we call the river section. So we hope that doesn't happen. We hope it's, you know, 50 years away and we won't have to worry about it. Anyway, all right, next, please. It's just a nice little image. There's there is in there a little lookout, which is very popular. The park has very few facilities really, but that lookout is used by a lot of people. By the way, Greater Melbourne has 1,367 indigenous plant species, and it's the most botanically rich area of any in Victoria. Our aim was to pick up on the species that were the sandbelt region, and there have been planted in the park well over 300 locally indigenous species. And we were very clear about having diverse forms as well. If you go to places, some parts of they're changing it now, but Royal Park, for instance, typically had grass, lawn, mostly lawns and trees, and nothing in between. But we know that to get real biodiversity, you need the shrubs, you need the climbers, you need the ground covers, you need the tall trees, you need the bushes. You know, we need everything. We need the wildflowers in order for it to be truly biodiverse. That's what needs to happen. So, you know, Melbourne's vegetation is very, very beautiful. Some of the flowers are tiny, and you need to get close up in seeing them, and I'll show you quite a lot of those shortly. But I think we underestimate the beauty of Victoria's vegetation and what might have been here many years ago. Subtle, I think, in colour and form. And you know, maybe this is a stretch, but I think it perhaps shaped Victoria's cultural aesthetic in being a bit more understated than even New South Wales and Queensland, definitely. But nonetheless, I think we have a bushland setting, and if you go to the park, you'll recognise that. You know, we leave logs on the ground because they're good for habitat for small animals. We leave, you know, we've mulched the park about 3 times over, so the soil is much more useful for planting, and it does look like it's not tidy. It's not a garden. It's not, people don't go and, you know, nip off the branches or the stems that might be dead. It's very much a bush park, and we love it that way. Although there is no watering in the park, so even though we've got 1/3 of the land is underwater or wetlands, we don't have an irrigation system. So, unfortunately, a lot of our plants do die. And we'd like at some stage to have a kind of a showpiece, part of the woodland walk perhaps, where you can show off these plants and they don't die, you know, in the terrible hot, dry weather that we sometimes get in Victoria. Okay, let's go on to a few. I've just picked up a few images with befores and afters. So here are all the ibis sitting on that the same bridge, and now there's a massive wattle tree, which is now in flower. You must go at this time of the year. It's fantastic, really. Okay, we'll just go through this really quickly. This was the dam. This was actually constructed by the City of Melbourne way back, 10 years ago maybe. And so that was to bring water in from Wharf Road and allow it to settle so that the sediment would go to the bottom and then flow into the freshwater lake on this side. But it's the most beautiful space, I think, in the park. It's always this great habitat for those big aquatic birds, ones that rely on water-based habitat. It's really quite something, and it's protected from people by and large. You know, you can look into it, but it's not a place for going in and walking around. So you get the big white ibis, not ibis, the egret, and many more really large birds there. A lot of the swans go in there for breeding. Okay, sorry, next. We're going to go fast. That's this is what we call first heath, and that's what it looked like when it was first erected. Okay, and this is the oval, and you can see there's a scrappy couple of trees sort of in the distance, and so now that whole ridge in the distance is revegetated and looking beautiful. Okay, so the Southern Wetlands Project, as I mentioned in that map of the park, this is the most recent project, and it was a massive project. So it's the reserve, the Howe Parade Extension Reserve, which has power lines and sewerage lines and pipes for oil and gas, and it's a reserve, a service corridor. In fact, what's happening right now is the duplication of the sewer across the river. So we are having massive shafts built in order to put another sewer line through under the river to over to Newport. And so that's taking up quite a bit of space in the park at the present time, but this is what it looked like. So blackberries, you name it, thick, dense weed, and it had been like that for a long time. We said, why not turn it over into the park? We'll look after it, we'll tidy it up, we'll create a series of wetlands, chain of ponds. Maybe we'll go to the next slide, Gary. A chain of ponds, and you can see this is an aerial shot. So it runs from right down here through to this point, and that's the river up the top there. So it was this strip here, and this photograph was taken during the excavation work along here. So quite a big project. So we had the big earth movers come in to do it. Fortunately, we have an earth mover who is very, very good at levels and understands topography, and is also very keen on nature. So he was fantastic. Right, next one maybe. And that's what it looked like about a year after it was finished. Right now, it's got less water in it, and it's got a lot of weeds, but that's the Southern Wetlands, and a series of ponds that we hope eventually will lead out to the river, but at the present time, we're not getting enough water in there for that to happen. Right, next. All right, just a few quick things about us. So we merged, that is, Friends of Westgate Park merged with the St Kilda Indigenous Nursery. We've been very closely associated for a long time, working together, and formed Westgate Biodiversity, Bili Nursery and Land Care. Skink started their operations in '97, so a bit earlier than Friends of Westgate Park. We estimate, well, we don't estimate it, we actually keep records of people who volunteer, and it's less than this now, but for the last 10 years, most of the last 10 years, we've averaged the equivalent of 8 full-time people in the park. That's really something. So if you were to fund eight staff to be looking after the park, it would be quite a costly exercise. Bili Nursery propagates over 150,000. We also propagate some in the nursery, in the compound at the park. So I mentioned Westgate Park, 40 hectares. We raised 3.5 million in grants and other income, all spent on Westgate Park. And we achieved deductible gift recipient status in last year. So if anyone has a mind to donate to Westgate Biodiversity, you will get a tax deduction. Right, next. Okay, we're just going to go fairly quickly through these pictures. These are the salt lake. You can see the salt marsh vegetation around the edge, that lovely, pinky red colour. And then this thing. You may have seen, maybe we'll go back for a moment. The pink lake happened at a time when we had very high temperatures, very low rainfall, and a lot of sun, and they are the factors which led to the lake turning pink. It is a complex relationship between an algae and a bacterium, neither of which is dangerous at all to people, but they collaborate, if you can use that word, in order to allow the algae to keep salt out of its cytoplasm. And it's a natural process. It's one that takes place in many places around the world. So there are pink lakes up in northwest Victoria, in Africa, in many places in the world. And there is also, it produces beta-carotene, and that's useful, I gather, in some cosmetic or some therapeutic process. Okay, next. Our problem, though, is people walking around the pink lake, taking selfies, and trampling on our precious and very vulnerable salt marsh vegetation. And it's worth knowing that most salt marsh has been cleared from Victoria. So it's a bit like mangroves, it's the first to go because people think it's ugly and smelly and whatnot, but it's a very important ecosystem for us to hang on to. So it doesn't look like that now, fortunately, because the lake is higher. We're getting more water. So we're getting water that's come from the bridge. What happens is the Vic Roads has a fire services testing regime that happens now every month. It used to be once every 3 months, but now it's every month. And massive amounts of potable water come now into the park, which is fantastic. So I think we won't see a pink lake again unless they find something else to do with the water, because the level of water in the salt lake is almost too high. Some of our salt marsh vegetation has been drowned. Anyway, next. I'm talking an awful lot here, so if you think I should stop, just give me the nod. Okay.
You haven't overstayed your welcome.
A lot of people don't get down here. They don't get to the river. And Westgate Park has a riverbank frontage, river frontage, wow, that's almost 1 kilometre long. And the Friends have revegetated all of the length of that, and some of it in this, you can't quite see it here, but most of it is a rock wall. However, at low tide, we get a nice little beach there. Not that anyone goes swimming, but we understand the water's actually not bad quality compared with what it might have been a few years ago. Okay, next. Just some little shots showing, grasses and ground covers and shrubs, and beyond that, trees. This is the high point, one of the higher hills in the park. And you can see there how dense some of this vegetation is. This is looking from the high point looking down. Yep. Look for xerochryzum disposum. We have grasslands that dry out, so this would have been in the middle of summer and things stop being green and turn into lovely silvery heads of seed. As I said earlier, we leave logs on the ground for habitat, but also for fungi, which we'll talk about in a minute. And our beautiful wombergias. They flower for so long; they're almost never out of bloom. Viminaria junkia. We planted that all the way along the southern wetlands, and at the time when it's in flower, I should have really taken a photograph when it was in flower. It's just this massive yellow. It's just extraordinary. And the beautiful Pattersonia. Albergia, of course, always gorgeous. Clematis. And then a whole lot more. So enormous variety and colour, some of the colours are absolutely spectacular. And when you look, I'll go back a bit, you look very closely at the three images on the bottom are Alocasia. And if you look very closely at them, the detail of them, it's an amazing pattern of colours, of reds and greens and yellows and dark blues, extraordinary. But you do need to get up close, which is why having a camera is useful. Okay, next. And birds. I'm not sure what the last count was, but I think we're up to about 64 species of birds. So sometimes the park seems empty of birds, some of the big ones, and then something happens, something dries up in northern Victoria, and we've got, a freshwater lake full of hardheads. Amazing birds. Royal spoonbill. These are huge birds and rare, rare in Melbourne. Imagine we're in the middle of an industrial zone, and here we've got these massive birds that we only really see in nature. And what they were doing in our large lagoon, we call it, is sifting out the small insects in the muddy surface of under the water, muddying it up too, I might say, but we don't mind that too much. The black-winged stilts, always in the park, not always in huge numbers, but they're there. And they seem to, the birds don't mind the salt lake being very salty. They seem very tolerant of that. And those pink legs, as they rise up and the pink legs dangle beneath, it's just wonderful. A Nanking night heron. I had never seen one of these, but they're strange. They're strange looking but beautiful. But this one occupies some trees on the small island. So you've got to be good to spot it, but that's very nice. And the beautiful white-faced heron. These are large birds. This would be a bird, this high. And of course, the beautiful pelican on the river. We do get pelican in the park as well, on the freshwater lake. And the swans. We have breeding pairs of swans in the park pretty much always. So I think two or three clutches. Do you say clutches for cygnets? I'm not sure. It's not uncommon for the park. And there are lots of, this is the dam, so there are lots of places to hide. They're safe, they're secure. No one's going to wander in and pinch eggs or ducklings. However, that said, we have foxes in the park. We wish we didn't, but we have foxes in the park, and they don't mind taking a cygnet or two. Right. And this ugly little Eurasian coot chick. Can't see it that well, but we have a lot of coots and swamp hens. We've had to protect some areas of vegetation from the swamp hens. They pull the whole tuber out, so they're not very helpful in vegetation, but it's a balancing thing, like it's nature. And the eastern great egret, isn't that beautiful? He has his breeding plume on. However, they don't breed unless they're in large numbers, and we've only ever seen one or two at a time, so we're not going to get any nesting anytime soon. And the spotted pardalote, beautiful little bird that prefers to nest on the side of a hill by making a tunnel into the hill. This little bird. It's hard to believe, but that's where it likes to nest. But it has some other qualities as well. It's very fond of silage. Now, you would have seen on eucalypt leaves where there's little holes have been drilled into the leaf. Very typically, that's because a small insect is hiding there on the leaf. It, it's drawing sugars from the plant, and it builds a sugary cap, really, so that it hides inside this cap. And the spotted cardlobe loves those psyllids, so it goes for the sugary psyllid. And here is nature at work, balancing one thing with another. And the grey-headed flying fox. We don't see a lot of them. Maybe we should go at night. It's a bit spooky at night, but I think that's where we'd see it. And the long-necked turtle, who unfortunately pulled his neck in as I was taking the photograph last time. They are amazing creatures, and they wander about in the park on the path. They look up at you and say, "What are you doing here?" But they breed every year as well. And some of they're not really afraid of people all that much. I guess it's that heavy shell they're carrying. But we often see the young in the water, and we've seen the female lay eggs. What they do is lay their eggs on a slope, quite close to a river, to a watery space. So the edge of the saltwater lake, typically. And they very, very carefully cover the eggs over with soil, and they put leaf litter on top, so you can't actually see where they've been. Extraordinary, effort. I think they're very much part of the food chain, so there'd be a lot of birds come to the park to eat the long-necked turtle babies. Blue-tongued lizard. I didn't have time to put up the skinks. We have found 4 species of skink in the park, and that happened in a very small area, really not much bigger than this room, where Melbourne Water has taken over an area of grasses and wildflowers and so on, and trees, in order to build this shaft for the sewer duplication. And they sent an ecologist out to fence off the area and capture whatever was in there. And they found 56 skinks, and a couple of them rare. So this is a tiny part of the park, a fraction of the park. If the skinks are in this place, they must be elsewhere. So I think that really demonstrates to us that if you have the habitat, you have the animals that come after it. And there's a tiger snake. I think we've all seen the tiger snake in the park. You wouldn't want to be bitten by one, but by and large, they slither away, as long as you don't stand on them.
First stick the 56 variety, the family, if the sewer's going there, does that disturb them?
The sewer is in the river section, so it's
not there. Not where there's 56 varieties.
Yeah, it's right there. So what they had to do was clear them because they're concreting that whole area. So they took them and placed them nearby in other habitat. Yeah. And look, we were fortunate that they captured them because we could get a good look at them. They're very, very elusive. They scuttle off if they see any sort of movement. So this ecologist that trapped them all was able to hold them up and take photos. All right, and of course we've got possums, and we're going to move quite quickly through these insects. So some amazing creatures, and this is the one I love. This is the sheoak moth. So you can see how camouflaged the one on here. That is caterpillar. It's this caterpillar here, and you can see it's got a red, like a headband. It's got hairs. It's got stripes. It's one of the most decorated creatures I think I've ever seen. But it's only ever on one plant, and that's the Alocasia littoralis. So we need them everywhere, otherwise, you know, these creatures are not going to survive. Okay. And pod-sucking bug. So not all seeds end up being plants, and they're food for a lot of small animals. And the giant slat-faced grasshopper, the spur-throated locust. Okay. And more butterflies, skipper, loads and loads of dragonflies and damselflies. And bees, so we've got the leafcutter bees with bee, which is a beautiful little creature. Stag, there's a terrible story about the golden stag beetle. We had Melbourne Museum team come to do a bio blitz, and they turned over a log, and this stag beetle was under it, and they captured it and showed it to us, and we put it down onto a log in order to get a good photograph of it, which we did. And then a second later, it flew into the air, and down came a wattle bird and just simply swallowed it.
Oh dear.
Yes. And the purple winged mantid, on a female, and more of the same, and the blue banded, of course, the sort of celebrated blue banded bee. There, we did a pollinator project where we mapped people, volunteers, citizen scientists turn up to stare at a group of flowers, watching what was pollinating. That was amazing. Okay. Beetles of all sorts of colours and shapes. Spiders, I haven't seen many spiders around lately, but we've got huge variety in spiders. This one I really love, just this is the same spider, the golden, the orb-weaving garden orb-weaving spider. It's the same, but it adjusts its colour according to its surroundings. And this spider here is sitting inside a perfectly designed seed case for the Bosnia cinerea, which opens out. The seeds sort of open out and turn open. There's this nice, shiny, comfortable little space in the middle that suits that little spider. Okay. All right, fungi next. We've got 70 species of fungi so far observed and identified in the park. Some of them tiny, like the little mycena up there, minuscule. We can just quickly go through these to get people have a flavour of them. So that's, there are by no means a number of, and this one, we'll stop here. This is a coral, and this is the first time we've seen a coral fungus in the park, and it turns out to be a pretty rare one. It's green staining coral. And it then came up in a larger area in the park the following year, and the year after that, and this year there's been none. So the conditions are obviously not right for it, but that was a pretty major find. And some pretty interesting ones here. The Cyathus stercoreus is what's called a bird's nest fungus, and you see those little balls in there. They're called periodoles, and what it does, and they're full of spores for the fungus. And what it does is wait until the rain falls on the edge of this device, this like cup, and out springs, as a drop of rain falls on it, out springs one of those periodoles, you know, this far away, and that happens until all of them are excluded from the nest. And then they open up over time, and the spores are blown around. Some stinkhorns, this one here. It spreads its spores by a sticky, smelly, brown substance, which it smells like rotting meat. So it attracts insects of all sorts, and what they do is, you know, bite a bit of it, eat part of the fungus itself, and then walk off and spread the spores in other ways. And then there's one above is just a little jelly that has grown year after year after year on one log in the park. And the little star-shaped mushroom here is also has spores in the sphere here. These sort of petals open up. It's a sort of a shell in the first instance. Then they split open and it forms this shape. And it too waits for the rain. So one drop of rain on that very papery sphere, the little mouth at the top, a little opening, and out spurts a little puff of spores. The other two are slime molds. So here and here. So we have slime molds in the park, which is pretty good. They're not quite fungi, but they are sort of in their own kingdom. But fungi is really important in ecosystems. So fungi breaks down woody material. It partners with trees, and orchids, for instance, cannot reproduce unless they have a fungal partner. It's critically important. I'm saying this as someone who's on the committee of Fungi Map too. So when I first went to the park after a lot of rain, there was fungi everywhere, and no one could tell me what it was. So I had to go off and find out, and so this led me on a big journey of discovery about fungi and what its role was and how important it was. All right, I think that's probably the end, is it, Gary?
Yes, that's the last one.
All right, I think we're done.
So we do see rain control the park.
We are, of course.
So are you?
The park is managed by Parks Victoria, has been forever. But in the last 3 or 4 years, there have been moves for the City of Melbourne to take over Westgate Park. So we hope that happens. It's a long time in coming, but our main objective is to have the park have money spent on the park so that there are better facilities, there are things for people to do. We don't even have a playground in the park. We don't have any, there's nothing that brings people to the park as a destination apart from the barbecue shelter, I suppose. So we're really hoping that the City of Melbourne takes on the park. At the present time, there's an argument about how much money the City of Melbourne will get in order to run the park, but we're hoping, especially with an election looming, we're hoping to get that decision as soon as possible. And what we will do is shift our nursery that's in Williamstown Road, the Bili Nursery in Williamstown Road, to that Wharf Road triangle that I mentioned, the empty one that we brought into the park, and to put the compound there as well. So our compound is pretty rough and ready. We've got, 3 containers with a little roof over the top of 2 of them, and that's about it. We've got running water, but it's not what you would call great amenities. So we're hoping to build a new compound where we can do workshops, where we can have talks, where we can do, have reasonable amenity for the many volunteers who come. So that's where we're at the present time. We think Melbourne will be a better partner for us as well in a number of ways, but we're not sure yet what that's going to look like.
How's the work going in Parks Victoria? I mean, you want to do some big projects. Make it more.
Yeah, but look, I'd have to say that Parks Victoria, for the most part, let us get on with, with what we wanted to do, as long as we were paying for it. I mean, we raised over $3 million for major projects. So a lot of those were Commonwealth funded. Some of them were state funded. So I think, you know, we're on the right track. They sort of agreed with us, but not really. I mean, I don't think Parks Victoria is that interested in biodiversity. You know, the other part of the organisation is Albert Park, which is all sporting facilities. So it was not unexpected that Parks Victoria would not get it in the way that we do. So I think we can, you know, we talk a lot about biodiversity, but without really understanding what it means. And I think that's the case with Parks Victoria. They talk about biodiversity, but you know, when it comes down to it, it's still grass and trees, and not a lot of trees. The fewer the better. So yeah, we have different we have a different vision for the park, but I think because Parks Victoria is so stretched for money, they spend all of $7,000 a year on the park, and that's for cleaning the toilets and the other thing, mowing the lawns, which they do very infrequently.
Do any of the Zoom people have any questions? Firstly, before John.
So, yeah. Any questions? If you want to unmute yourself.
The silence. John. John and then Jim.
I've been past there hundreds of times and haven't realised the significance of the park. You know, the way it's painted, you can't really think much about it. But seeing it as you present now, it's wonderful, and I agree with it. But I see as a bit of a threat from developers, either industrial or homeowner owners. Is what protection the Parks Victoria have against developers going in that area?
Well, it's Crown land, they can't do that. Although Parks Victoria, in some parks, you know, some of the bigger parks around Victoria, I know, you know, having putting motels and things in, but I can't see it happening in Westgate Park. We'd fight too hard for one thing.
A lot of state people sold in the 90s.
Yeah. Look, I don't think so. I think that the biggest threat to us is the railway line coming through the park that'll just, you know, destroy. It'll be a double line instead of a single line. It's going to cut off the two sections of the park. It's going to take out all of the wetlands. That's our biggest threat.
Is that railway line?
Yeah. It's been pulled up in the port. It's been pulled up, you know, in many places towards the city. It will be a major undertaking to be able to put that in because they wanted to cross the river and all sorts.
I read in the last month or so that the train lines have been along the Nursery. It's possibly terminated. Nursery, I don't know about that.
Yeah, there have been a few proposals. Janet's probably
Oh,
better
no,
across
that's
this.
very active.
Is it? Yeah.
But there is also, John, a proposal to bring the tram track right into the park,
Oh,
in fact,
right.
right up to the bridge.
Yeah.
Well, we don't think so. We don't think it needs to go right up to the bridge. It would be better to stop at where the park starts rather than going.
We can argue either way.
Yeah.
The main thing is that it's a nice little area that's been protected by fanatics like you.
Fanatics like us, yeah, that's right.
Jim, last question.
You made a comment about a tower that never got funded. It seems to me that would be a fantastic thing that you can look down at the park and see the whole thing from above. And secondly, you can look at Williamstown, you look at the city. I thought that would be a bit of a trust.
Which is the kind
As
of
everyone public funds.
yeah, which is the kind of project you would expect a City of Melbourne to be interested in funding. Parks Victoria just doesn't have the money for anything like that. I mean, we'd like to put in bird hides and a children's playground and a climbing wall or a, you know, there's lots of beautiful things you can put into a park. We need to attract families. A lot of people come to the park, but very often they're just going through. So if there was a tower with a lookout, you know, that would be very attractive to people. People like that, you know, and why not? Oh, the view from even the hill, the highest hill that's there is pretty spectacular. So, yeah, I agree.
Must be a friend around there on my point. I have to be the most unobservant guy around. Because
You've said none of that.
I've seen a couple of birds, that's about it.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
that's
Well,
been
we
my
have,
presentation.
we have a, if you're interested in learning a bit more about birds, we do a monthly survey. So Rob Yule leads that, and they're always looking for people to come. And very often they're people who don't have a clue what's what, and they learn very quickly what they see or hear. I think, you know, good bird watchers know what the sounds are of birds. I mean, we have the biggest population in Melbourne of fairy wrens. You would have seen them, you must have seen them. Fairy wrens, tiny, tiny birds, tail sticking up in the air.
I've seen those birds around Port Melbourne in the trees around there, you know, up in Queenstown Road. I hardly see any birds.
Yeah, I have to say during COVID, I found a lot of birds, a lot of different ones, because it was quieter, quieter in that area. There was a group of us that were taking photos all the time. I had those little lorikeets that were up on the side. Yeah. Anyway, I'll have to draw it to a close. Thank you so much. Oh, how impressive. Presentation. You can probably add it to a collect. No, I actually wanted to thank you for an enlightening presentation.
Oh, but it was.
Because people like me, you know, you sail over the Westgate Bridge, oh yeah, one model is, and that is down, and you take absolutely very little notice. So I'm so impressed with the passion of the people who have been involved in it and what has been created and what could be created if people knew a little bit more. So thank you.
So do you think people might be interested in leading a little walk around?
Oh yes, I'd come. Yes, yes, that would be a great idea.
Well, maybe we
Yeah, let's do it.
We're a bit specific, aren't they? Anyway, thank you very much. And
It's my pleasure.
this is a whole